By saying this rose is red or this picture is beautiful, we declare that it is not we who from outside attach beauty to the picture or redness to the rose, but that these are the characteristics proper to these objects. An additional fault in the way in which formal logic conceives the judgment is that it makes the judgment look as if it were something merely contingent, and does not offer any proof for the advance from notion on to judgment. For the notion does not, as understanding supposes, stand still in its own immobility, it is rather an infinite form of boundless activity, as it were the punctum silens, or jumping point of all vitality, and thereby self differentiating. This disruption of the notion into the difference of its constituent functions, a disruption imposed by the native act of the notion, is the judgment. A judgment, therefore, means the particularizing of the notion. No doubt the notion is implicitly the particular, but in the notion, as notion, the particular is not yet explicit and still remains in transparent unity with the universal. Thus, for example, as we remark before, or as we remarked before, paragraph section 160 and the note, the germ of a plant contains its particulars such as roots, branches, leaves, and the like, but these details are at first present only potentially and are not realized till the germ uncloses. The unclosing is, as it were, the judgment of the plant. The illustration may also serve to show how neither the notion nor the judgment are merely found in our head or merely framed by us. The notion is the very heart of things and makes them what they are. To form a notion of an object means, therefore, to become aware of its notion. And when we proceed to a criticism or judgment of the object, we are not performing a subjective act and merely ascribing this or that predicate to the object. We are, on the contrary, observing the object in the specific character imposed by its notion. Encyclopedia section 167. The judgment is usually taken in a subjective sense as an operation and a form, occurring merely in self-conscious thought. This distinction, however, has no existence on purely logical principles by which the judgment is taken in the quite universal signification that all things are a judgment, that is to say, they are individuals, which are a universality or inner nature in themselves, a universal which is individualized. Their universality and individuality are distinguished, but the one is at the same time identical with the other. The interpretation of the judgment, according to which it is assumed to be merely subjective, as if we ascribed a predicate to a subject, is contradicted by the decidedly objective expression of the judgment. The rose is red, gold is a metal. It is not by us that something is first ascribed to them. A judgment is, however, distinguished from a proposition. The latter contains a statement about the subject, which does not stand to it in any universal relationship, but expresses some single action, or some state, or the like. Thus, Caesar was born at Rome in such and such a year, waged war in Gaul for 10 years, crossed the Rubicon, and the like, are propositions, but not judgments. Again, it is absurd to say that such statements as, I slept well last night, or present arms, may be turned into the form of a judgment. A carriage is passing by would be a judgment, and a subjective one at best, only if it were doubtful whether the passing object was a carriage, or whether it and not rather the point of observation was in motion. In short, only if it were desired to specify a conception which was still short of appropriate specification. Encyclopedia, paragraph 168. The judgment is an expression of finitude. Things from its point of view are said to be finite because they are a judgment, because their definite being and their universal nature, their body and their soul, though united, indeed, otherwise the thing would be nothing, are still elements in the constitution which are already different and also in any case separable. Encyclopedia section 169. The abstract terms of the judgment, the individual is the universal, present the subject as negatively self relating, as what is immediately concrete, while the predicate is what is abstract, indeterminate, in short, the universal. But the two elements are connected together by an is, and thus the predicate, in its universality, must also contain the speciality of the subject, must in short have particularity, and so is realized the identity between subject and predicate, which being thus unaffected by this difference in form is the content. It is the predicate which first gives the subject, which till then was on its own account a bare mental representation or an empty name, its specific character and content. In judgments like God is the most real of all things, or the absolute is the self identical, God and the absolute are mere names. What they are, we only learn in the predicate. What the subject may be in other respects as a concrete thing is no concern of this judgment. Compare Encyclopedia section 31. To define the subject as that of which something is said, and the predicate as what is said about it, is mere trifling. It gives no information about the distinction between the two. In point of thought, the subject is primarily the individual and the predicate the universal. As the judgment receives further development, the subject ceases to be merely the immediate individual and the predicate merely the abstract universal. The former acquires the additional significations of particular and universal, the latter the additional significations of particular and individual. Thus, while the same names are given to the two terms of the judgment, their meaning passes through a series of changes. Encyclopedia section 170. We now go closer into the speciality of subject and predicate. The subject as negative self-relation. See Encyclopedia sections 163 and 166. The subject as negative self-relation is the stable substratum in which the predicate has its subsistence and where it is ideally present. The predicate as the phrase is inheres in subject. Further, as the subject is in general and immediately concrete, the specific connotation of the predicate is only one of the numerous characters of the subject. Thus, the subject is ampler and wider than the predicate. I'm going to repeat a section again because of the Latin I pronounced incorrectly. The predicate as the phrase is iner, meaning stick in the subject. Or maybe you can describe it as a spoke in the tire. So the predicate as the phrase is iner, or the spoke in the tire, in the subject, or we would say the predicate as the phrase is as a spoke in a tire. So the predicate is in the subject as a spoke is within a tire. Further, as the subject in general and immediately concrete, the specific connotation of the predicate is only one of the numerous characters of the subject. Thus, the subject is ampler and wider than the predicate. Conversely, the predicate as universal is self-subsistent and indifferent whether the subject is or not. The predicate outflanks the subject, subsuming it under itself, and hence on its side is wider than the subject. The specific content of the predicate, see, for example, paragraph section 169. The subject content of the predicate alone constitutes the identity of the two. Encyclopedia section 171. At first, subject, predicate, and the specific content or the identity are, even in their relation, still put in the judgment as different and divergent. By implication, however, that is, in their notion, they are identical, for the subject is a concrete totality, which means not any indefinite multiplicity, but individuality alone. The particular and the universal in an identity, and the predicate too is the very same unity. See Encyclopedia section 170. The copula again, even while stating the identity of subject and predicate, does so at first only by an abstract is. Conformably to such an identity, the subject has to be put also in the characteristic of the predicate. By this means, the latter also receives the characteristic of the former, so that the copula receives its full complement and full force. And according to New Oxford American Dictionary, copula, copula, in logic and grammar is a noun, a connecting word, in particular, a form of the verb be, connecting a subject and complement. Its derivatives are copular, an adjective. Its origin is early 17th century from Latin, connection, linking of words, from co, together, plus apere, fasten. So that which joins things together. Uh, for instance, if you are to get married, you are often joined together by a ceremony of a religious official or a state official, meaning a secular official, and they bring you together. And often the sign of your marriage is a contract, and people know that you're married by wearing a ring on a particular finger. This is one way that we can see a copula. So the copula could be the contract, the wedding ceremony, the ring itself. There's sometimes people tie a ribbon around their hands, and that's literally a sign of being joined together. But the point is, whatever joins you together is essential. We say in the tradition of, let's just call it peripatetic learning, or the Gnostic tradition, the copula between you, an interested person in this tradition, and the tradition itself is an initiation. That initiation can be from person to person. I seek knowledge, and you say, I have knowledge to offer you and will offer it to you. And we combine our hands together. We call that a handshake. Or you sign up at a university and you say, I seek knowledge. And they say, well, you've applied here and we agree to admit you to our university. And upon completion of certain courses, we will say that you have achieved whatever it is we offer here. And you have a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, a doctorate. And so you are coupled, your copula has been achieved with that institution. But the word we're looking for, that I'm looking for, is a copula is an initiation, which allows a subject to be affixed to a predicate. The subject is what is sought, and according to metaphysics, would be the tradition or the idea is the subject. And then the copula is the one providing access to the subject. Access could be in just reading it, or really in how to understand it. And the predicate would be the person or organization, for instance, but the person who has sought it and gained the right permission to have it. So instead of just reading Hegel, you could buy this book on the Amazon Kindle and have it read out to you. Either buy it in the current printed editions that you'll find on Kindle, or, and this is again assuming you're on a laptop or a computer, or you could download it from Project Gutenberg, and I believe if you went into and then uh, it's called a it's a particular type of file, but it'll tell you that it's a Kindle file. Then you go in and start under Tools in your Kindle, Amazon Kindle. You start speech to text. And with speech to text or Control plus T, the book will read out to you. It'll read out every part of it as it is written. It will even use those spaces in between words to space itself so you can hear it that way. You won't have any commentary with it. And one would argue that you have the subject and you the predicate, and then your teacher at that point is we'll call it artificial intelligence, the program, which then presents the information as it is programmed to present it. I want that to be a possibility in the future that it can offer an initiation. Uh, and you will have the understanding that it's possible for that device to offer you. Or you have me who may not read it perfectly. I'll slip over a word or stop here or there, but I will translate words. I will tell you the tradition. I will tell you what I've gained beforehand and make certain understandings known to you. And so then I offer a type of copula of initiation to those who are listening. However, uh, the real copula for the tradition, or the let's say the more perfect one, because those the, the two I've mentioned are real, is that you sit with the person who has an expertise in this tradition, maybe even in the German from its original, and is able to offer you uh, true insight into this book or into the metaphysical tradition itself, and you can ask questions. The person knows you. They know your mental capabilities, your family grouping, your social situation, where you need to improve on in life, and they guide you to greater knowledge. Now, from a sense of initiation, you could walk away from listening to this on Kindle or listen with the speech to text Control T, or you can listen to it on YouTube or wherever else you're getting this recording and be initiated, be coupled with copula, with the subject of it, and have the success that comes from having been initiated in it, and then go seek a teacher to expound upon it. And it's very common that one goes, or it's not so common, but it is the tradition or the way that you go into one organization or to one person and you become initiated, and then you find yourself somewhere else where your education is carried out. And you'll say, well, it may not even seem relevant to the original initiation that you received, but you'll find out soon enough or in time that what you learned beforehand, and that was called a tradition that intentionally said, we are here teaching metaphysics, we are here teaching uh, religion from the Judeo Christian standpoint, we are here teaching Hermeticism as Sufism within Islam. We're teaching you the way. This is the way, kind of deal from the Mandalorian. People who say that, and this is, and go forth and seek it out. Go seek the truth. Go seek the light. Uh, though that, then you'll find yourself in other situations where now you're wearing, people will call them rose-colored glasses. And everywhere you go, you've been so impacted by what you've learned from those initiators that wherever you go, whatever you do, in every other situation, all you can think of, uh, all you can, let's say, everything is filtered through the logic of Hegel, for instance, which is a goal, or the Hermeticism of the Book of Isaiah, or something like that, or Jesus's logic, or Jesus's presentation of the great question. All those things are the lens you're looking through, and so that lens, those rose-colored glasses, become your copula uh, to the tradition as a whole. And of course, like the seed and germ metaphor, you have that seed, and according to your capacity and the information you're able to receive, it will grow into the plant that it is able to grow into, whether a sage bush or a redwood tree. Maybe it'll grow into a jackal or a lion, if that's the ability, because seed can also be spermazoa entering an egg, and it may grow into something living in that respect too, animate living. So copula is what this word is, and it's significant. Copula is being used instead of the word, or instead of the what we call the word to be, or is, are, were. Copula, and the copula is the word is, and is indicates the word I. And having an is and an I in relation to yourself means you are free. Otherwise, as we read earlier, if someone else is your is or is your I, you are subject to slavery with them until you get your is or I. Even if you've never been purchased, even if you're a billionaire, uh, that is your estate. And I'll tell you that it is not necessarily the worst thing in the world to be in that state if you don't have a desire to be alone and exclusive. What is poor to be in, even if you have an is or an I, is to be under duress. And duress and harm and pain and suffering are, I believe, worse than being, well, coupled with another who has a greater influence over you, unless they're one of the same thing. If you can get your is or I and have no duress, we would say that this is the ideal. And it's your responsibility at that point either to continue living it out perfectly and or to help other people get to that point where they have an is and an I, and then you release them from their dependency, their enslavement, as it were, to you, and they move on. But we will say in the tradition, we do have, so you can go back to the Jewish tradition, and you would say that, Adam was the first of a certain group, and his son Seth eventually would be born from he and his wife Eve. And from Seth, eventually, we would have Enoch. And from Enoch, we would eventually have Noah. From Noah, we would eventually have Abraham. And from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, uh, and down to Judah and David, Solomon, or down from Judah, I would say, to eventually Jesus Christ or others. So we would be able to say there is a coupling of individuals by birth. There are also a coupling of individuals by one pope leads to another pope leads to another pope, or one president to another president to another. And in that respect, even though you were dependent on your predecessor at some point, maybe just as a citizen of a country, upon their leaving that office and upon their death, you gain a certain freedom from them. And so your coupling to them no longer takes the role of a slave, but you have a freedom. So if you're enslaved and your master dies and you're not carried over in that slavery by his family, you become free and you gain an is, an I. And at that point, hopefully, you've been preparing for what it is you want to do once you gain freedom. You go out into the world with your freedom, and you debate whether or not you just want to live your freedom or if you want to help others achieve theirs according to your capacity. Uh, so I'll leave it to your is and I to make that determination. By this means, the latter also receives the characteristic of the former, so that the copula receives its full complement and full force. Such is the continuous specification by which the judgment, through a copula charged with content, comes to be a syllogism, as it is primarily exhibited in the judgment. This gradual specification consists in giving to an originally abstract, sensuous universality the specific character of allness, of species, of genus, and finally of the developed universality of the notion. After we are made aware of this continuous specification of the judgment, we can see a meaning and an interconnection in what are usually stated as the kinds of judgment. Not only does the ordinary enumeration seem purely casual, but it is also superficial and even bewildering in its statement of their distinctions. The distinction between positive, categorical, and assertory judgments is either a pure invention of fancy or is left undetermined. On the right theory, the different judgments follow necessarily from one another and present the continuous specification of the notion, for the judgment itself is nothing but the notion specified. When we look at the two preceding spheres of being and essence, we see that the specified notions as judgments are reproductions of these spheres, but put in the simplicity of relation peculiar to the notion. The various kinds of judgment are no empirical aggregate. They are a systematic whole based on a principle, and it was one of Kant's great merits to have first emphasized the necessity of showing this. His proposed division, according to the headings in his table of categories, into judgments of quality, quantity, relation, and modality, cannot be called satisfactory, partly from the merely formal application of this categorical rubric, partly on account of their content. Still, it rests upon a true perception of the fact that the different species of judgment derive their features from the universal forms of the logical idea itself. If we follow this clue, it will supply us with three chief kinds of judgment, parallel to the stages of being, essence, and notion. The second of these kinds, as required by the character of essence, which is the stage of differentiation, must be doubled. We find the inner ground for this systematization or systematization we find the inner ground for this systematization of judgments in the circumstance that when the notion, which is the unity of being and essence in a comprehensive thought, unfolds as it does in the judgment, it must reproduce these two stages in a transformation proper to the notion. The notion itself, meanwhile, is seen to mold and form the genuine grade of judgment. Far from occupying the same level and being equal of value, the different species of judgment form a series of steps, the difference of which rests upon the logical significance of the predicate. The judgments differ in value. The judgments differ in value. That judgments differ in value is evident even in our ordinary ways of thinking. We should not hesitate to ascribe a very slight faculty. We should not hesitate to ascribe a very slight faculty of judgment to a person who habitually framed only such judgments as, this wall is green, this stove is hot. On the other hand, we should credit with a genuine capacity of judgment the person whose criticisms dealt with such questions as whether a certain work of art was beautiful, whether a certain action was good, and so on. In judgments of the first mentioned kind, the content forms only an abstract quality, the presence of which can be sufficiently detected by immediate perception. To pronounce a work of art to be beautiful or an action to be good requires, on the contrary, a comparison of the objects with what they ought to be, in essence, with their notion. Hegel, Encyclopedia Philosophy, Section 1, Logic, the science of the idea in and for itself, Billahil Dhat wa Lillahi Jama'a, Chapter 9, third subdivision of logic, the doctrine of the notion, quasi subdivision A, the subjective notion, infra subdivision B, the judgment, metasection alpha, qualitative judgment. Encyclopedia section 172. The immediate judgment is the judgment of definite being. The subject is invested with a universality as its predicate, which is an immediate and therefore a sensible quality. It may be 1. A positive judgment. The individual is a particular, but the individual is not a particular. Or, in more precise language, such a single quality is not congruous with the concrete nature of the subject. This is, number 2, a negative judgment. It is one of the fundamental assumptions of dogmatic logic that qualitative judgments, such as the rose is red or is not red, can contain truth. Correct they may be, in essence, in the limited circle of perception, of finite conception and thought that depends on the content, which likewise is finite and on its own merits untrue. Truth, however, as opposed to correctness, depends solely on the form. When viewed as, on the notion as it is put, or when viewed through the lens on the notion as it is put, and the reality corresponding to it. Truth, however, as opposed to correctness, depends solely on the form viewed on the notion as it is put, and the reality corresponding to it. but truth on that stamp is not found in the qualitative judgment. In common life, the terms truth and correctness are often treated as synonymous. We speak of the truth of a content when we are only thinking of its correctness. Correctness, generally speaking, concerns only the formal coincidence between our conception and its content. Whatever the constitution of this content may be, truth, on the contrary, lies in the coincidence of the object with itself, that is, with its notion. That a person is sick or that someone has committed a theft may certainly be correct, but the content is untrue. A sick body is not in harmony with the notion of body, and there is a want of congruity between theft and the notion of human conduct. These instances may show that an immediate judgment in which an abstract quality is predicated of an immediately individual thing, however correct it may be, cannot contain truth. The subject and predicate of it do not stand to each other in relation of reality and notion. We may add that the untruth of the immediate judgment lies in the incongruity, lies in the incongruity. We may add that the untruth of the immediate judgment lies in the incongruity between its form and content. To say this rose is red involves, in virtue of the copula, is the coincidence of subject and predicate. The coincidence of To say this rose is red involves, in virtue of the copula, is the coincidence of subject and predicate. The rose, however, is a concrete thing, and so is not red only. It has also an odor, a specific form, and many other features not implied in the predicate red. The predicate on its part is an abstract universal, and does not apply to the rose alone. There are other flowers and other objects which are red too. The subject and predicate in the immediate judgment touch, as it were, only in a single point, but do not cover each other. The case is different with the notional judgment. In pronouncing an action to be good, we frame a notational judgment. Here, as we at once perceive, there is a closer and a more intimate relation than in the immediate judgment. The predicate is the latter. The predicate in the latter is some abstract quality which may or may not be applied to the subject. In the judgment of the notion, the predicate is, as it were, the soul of the subject, by which the subject, as the body of this soul, is characterized through and through. Encyclopedia section 173. This negation of a particular quality, which is the first negation, still leaves the connection of the subject with the predicate subsisting. The predicate is in that manner a sort of relative universal, of which a special phrase, the predicate is in that manner a sort of relative universal, of which a special phase only has been negatived. To say that the rose is not red implies that it is still colored in the first place with another color, which, however, would be only one more positive judgment. The individual, however, is not a universal. Hence, 3. The judgment suffers disruption into one of two forms. So before I read that, let me read 1 and 2 again. 1, a positive judgment. The individual is a particular, but the individual is not a particular, or in more precise language, such a single quality is not congruous with the concrete nature of the subject. This is 2, a negative judgment. 3, the judgment suffers disruption into one of two forms. It is either the identical judgment, an empty identical relation stating that the individual is the individual, or it is B, what is called the infinite judgment, in which we are presented with the total incompatibility of subject and predicate. Examples of the latter are: the mind is no elephant. A lion is no table. Propositions which are correct but absurd, exactly like the identical propositions: a lion is a lion. Mind is mind. Propositions like these are undoubtedly the truth of the immediate, or as it is called, qualitative judgment. But they are not judgments at all, and can only occur in a subjective thought where even an untrue abstraction may hold its ground. In their objective aspect, these latter judgments express the nature of what is, or of sensible things, which are, as they declare, suffer disruption into an empty identity on the one hand, and on the other a fully charged relation, only that this relation is the qualitative antagonism of the things related, their total incongruity. The negatively infinite judgment, in which the subject has no relation whatever to the predicate, gets its place in the formal logic solely as a nonsensical curiosity. But the infinite judgment is not really a mere casual form adopted by subjective thought. It exhibits the proximate result of the dialectical process in the immediate judgment preceding the positive and simply negative, and distinctly displays their finitude and untruth. Crime may be quoted as an objective instance of the negatively infinite judgment. The person committing a crime, such as a theft, does not, as in a suit about civil rights, merely deny the particular right of another person to some one definite thing. He denies the right of that person in general, and therefore he is not merely forced to restore what he has stolen, but is punished in addition because he has violated law as law. In essence, law in general. The civil lawsuit, on the contrary, is an instance of the negative judgment, pure and simple, where merely the particular law is violated, whilst law in general is so far acknowledged. Such a dispute is precisely paralleled by a negative judgment, like "this flower is not red," by which we merely deny the particular color of the flower, but not its color in general, which may be blue, yellow, or any other. Similarly, death, as a negatively infinite judgment, is distinguished from disease, as simply negative. In disease, merely this or that function of life is checked, or negative in death, as we ordinarily say, body and soul part. In essence, subject and predicate utterly diverge. Hegel, Encyclopedia Philosophy, Section 1, Logic, the science of the idea in and for itself, billahi dhat wa lillahi jama'a. Chapter 9, third subdivision of logic, the doctrine of the notion, quasi subdivision A, the subjective notion, infra subdivision B, the judgment, meta section beta, judgment of reflection. Encyclopedia section 174. The individual put as individual, in essence, as reflected into self, into the judgment, has a predicate in comparison with which the subject, as self relating, continues to be still an other thing. In existence, the subject ceases to be immediately qualitative. It is in correlation and interconnection with an other thing, with an external world. In this way, the universality of the predicate comes to signify this relativity. Ergo, useful or dangerous, weight or acidity, or again, instinct are examples of such relative predicates. The judgment of reflection is distinguished from the qualitative judgment by the circumstance that it predicates, pardon, or maybe not. The judgment of reflection is distinguished from the qualitative judgment by the circumstance that its predicate is not an immediate or abstract quality, but of such a kind as to exhibit the subject as in relation to something else. When we say ergo, therefore, this rose is red, we regard the subject in its immediate individuality and without reference to anything else. If, on the other hand, we frame the judgment, this plant is medicinal, we regard the subject, plant, as standing in connection with something else, the sickness which it cures, by means of its predicate, its medicinality. The case is the same with judgment, like this body is elastic, this instrument is useful, this punishment has a deterrent influence. In every one of these instances, the predicate is some category of reflection. They all exhibit an advance beyond the immediate individuality of the subject, but none of them goes so far as to indicate the adequate notion of it. It is this mode of judgment that ordinary raisonnement luxuriates. Raisonnement means reasoning. So it is in this mode of judgment that ordinary raisonnement or reasoning luxuriates. The greater the concreteness of the object in question, the more points of view does it offer to reflection, by which, however, its proper nature or notion is not exhausted. Why raisonnement and not reasoning? Well, because of the addition of the word luxuriates. Reasoning is something that in English we're taught to do in order not to misinterpret something. Raisonnement is something we earn the ability to do in order to sit back and be free of propaganda, and that is a form of luxuriating. Encyclopedia section 175, topic 1. Firstly, then, the subject, the individual as individual. Firstly, then, the subject, the individual as individual, in the singular judgment is a universal. But, 2. Secondly, in this relation, it is elevated above its singularity. This enlargement is external, due to subjective reflection, and at first in an indefinite number of particulars. This is seen in the particular judgment, which is obviously negative as well as positive. The individual is divided in itself. Partly it is self related, partly related to something else. 3. Thirdly, some are the universal. Particularity is thus enlarged to universality, or universality is modified through the individuality of the subject and appears as allness, community, the ordinary universality of reflection. The subject, receiving as in the singular judgment a universal predicate, is carried out beyond its mere individual self. To say, this plant is wholesome, implies not only that this singular plant is wholesome, but that some or several are so. We have thus the particular judgment. Some plants are wholesome, some men are inventive and similar. By means of particularity, the immediate individual comes to lose its independence and enters into an interconnection with something else. Man, as this man, is not the single man alone. He stands beside other men and becomes one in the crowd. Just by this means, however, he belongs to his universal and is consequently raised. The particular judgment is as much negative as positive. If only some bodies are elastic, it is evident that the rest are not elastic. On this fact again depends the advance to the third form of the reflective judgment, viewed by the judgment of allness. All men are mortal, all metals conduct electricity. It is as all that the universal is in the first instance generally encountered by reflection. The individuals form for reflection the foundation, and it is only our subjective action which collects and describes them as all. So far, the universal has the aspect of an external fastening that holds together a number of independent individuals, which have not the least affinity towards it. This semblance of indifference is, however, unreal, for the universal is the ground and foundation, the root and substance of the individual. If, ergo, we take Caius, Titus, Sempronius, and the other inhabitants of a town or country, the fact that all of them are men is not merely something which they have in common, but their universal or kind, without which these individuals would not be at all. The case is very different with that superficial generality falsely so called, which really means only what attaches or is common to all the individuals. It has been remarked, for example, that men, in contradistinction from the lower animals, possess in common the appendage of earlobes. It is evident, however, that the absence of these earlobes in one man or another would not affect the rest of his being, character, or capacities, whereas it would be nonsense to suppose that Caius, without being a man, would still be brave, learned, and similar. The individual man is what he is in particular, only in so far as he is before all things a man as man and in general. And that generality is not something external to or something in addition to other abstract qualities, or to mere features discovered by reflection. It is what permeates and includes in it everything particular. Encyclopedia section 176. The subject being thus likewise characterized as a universal, there is an express identification of subject and predicate, by which at the same time the specialty of the judgment form is deprived of all importance. This unity of the content being the universality which is identical with the negative reflection in self of the subject, makes the connection in judgment a necessary one. The advance, the advance from the reflective judgment of allness to the judgment of necessity is found in our usual modes of thought when we say that whatever appertains to all appertains to the species and is therefore necessary. To say all plants or all men is the same thing as to say the plants or the man. Hegel, Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Section 1, Logic, the science of the idea in and for itself, Billahi Dhat wa Lillahi Jama'a, Chapter 9, third subdivision of logic, the doctrine of the notion, quasi subdivision A, the subjective notion, infra subdivision B, the judgment, metasection gamma, judgment of necessity. Encyclopedia section 70, Encyclopedia section 177, the judgment of necessity, in essence, of the identity of the content in its difference, 1, contains in the predicate partly the substance or nature of the subject, the concrete universal, the genus, partly seeing that this universal also contains the specific character as negative. The predicate represents the exclusive essential character, the species. This is the categorical judgment. 2. Conformably to their substantiality, the two terms receive the aspect of independent actuality. Their identity is then inward only, and thus the actuality of the one is at the same time not its own, but the being of the other. This is the hypothetical judgment. 3. If in this self surrender and self alienation of the notion, its inner identity is at the same time explicitly put, the universal is the genus which is self identical in its mutually exclusive individualities. This judgment, which has this universal for both its terms, the one time as a universal, the other time as the circle of its self-excluding particularization in which the either or as much as the as well as stands for the genus is the disjunctive judgment. Universality at first as a genus and now also as the circuit of its species is thus described and expressly put as a totality. The categorical judgment, such as gold is a metal, the rose is a plant, is the unmediated judgment of necessity and finds within the sphere of essence its parallel in the relation of substance. All things are a categorical judgment. In other words, they have their substantial nature, forming their fixed and unchangeable substratum. It is only when things are studied from the point of view of their kind, and as with necessity determined by the kind, that the judgment first begins to be real. It betrays a defective logical training to place upon the same level judgments like gold is dear and judgments like gold is a metal. That gold is dear is a matter of external connection between it and our wants or inclinations, the costs of obtaining it, and other circumstances. Gold remains the same as it was, though the external reference is altered or removed. Metalleity, on the contrary, constitutes the substantial nature of gold, apart from which it and all else that is in it or can be predicated of it would be unable to subsist. The same is the case if we say Caius is a man. We express by that whatever else he may be has worth and meaning only when it corresponds to his substantial nature or manhood. But even the categorical judgment is to a certain extent defective. It fails to give due place to the function or element of particularity. Thus, gold is a metal, it is true, but so are silver, copper, iron, and metalleity as such has no learnings to any of its particular species. In these circumstances, we must advance from the categorical to the hypothetical judgment, which may be expressed in the formula: if A is, B is. The present case exhibits the same advance as formerly took place from the relation of substance to the relation of cause. In the hypothetical judgment, the specific character of the content shows itself mediated and dependent on something else. And this is exactly the relation of cause and effect. And if we were to give a general interpretation to the hypothetical judgment, we should say that it expressly realizes the universal in its particularizing. This brings us to the third form of the judgment of necessity, the disjunctive judgment. A is either B or C or D. A work of poetic art is either epic or lyric or dramatic. Color is either yellow or blue or red. The two terms in the disjunctive judgment are identical. The genus is the sum total of the species, and the sum total of the species is the genus. This unity of the universal and the particular is the notion, and it is the notion which, as we now see, forms the content of the judgment. I want to give a note on the text before it comes to a completion. We still have a bit of time before the completion comes, but it is nearing. The original text that Hegel wrote in was German. German, German is a language that has grades. High German, as I've come to understand it, please forgive me for anyone in the current Republic of Germany, or the state of Germany, or the Republic of Germany, which is broken up into states. Uh, High German is spoken in Austria. Middle German is spoken in Germany, and Low German is spoken in the United Kingdom. Pidgin German is spoken in the United States. Uh, Low German is English. And while English has aspects of French, basically it has aspects of Romance language in it, uh, it is overwhelmingly a Germanic language. So what we just read in Encyclopedia section 177 was really an English lesson, or I would say a German lesson. And because this text was written in German, probably Middle German, and then translated into Scottish English, which is why we have the spaces between words, a Scottish person and an American person like myself has a certain way of speaking that runs every word together. And because of it, it is important to show where to make breaks, one for translation purposes, or so an English person, a person from the British person, I should say, a Briton, or a German listening to this will understand what we're saying. So it may have had these spaces because it was written in Middle German so that an Austrian can understand. And now that it is written uh, or translated by a Scotsman, William Wallace, it has these spaces so that an American can read it. Uh, and Americans can understand it. And when that American reads it, a Briton can understand, or let's say a person who speaks English from England, they can understand it. And so can others who are second language learners. So we just had an English lesson on how English is spoken. The equivalent would be if you are studying Chinese, Mandarin, let's say you're studying Mandarin, and you've memorized 10,000 words, right? Whether or not you understand the characters, and you begin to speak, you may or may not be understood for the content of what you're saying, but Chinese Mandarin has intonation. There are tones and even sounds that are made to indicate what form of the word you mean and how you feel about it. Also, who you are in relation to the person you're speaking with matters too. So, the logic of the person speaking and their use of judgment, the car is moving fast. That's a good judgment. The car is red. Now, if you said the car is red and it is moving fast, I think, oh no, a police officer is going to stop it because I know something about red cars moving fast. But if your judgments are often things like the car is red, the road is black, the person is tall, which are not really judgments at all, and then you say something like, uh, the mountain is difficult to climb. I'm going to assume someone told you the mountain is difficult to climb, that you know it, because it is not consistent with your other judgments or your other pronouncements. And so this is a way that a judge, I have a legal background, a judge listening to the majority of your statements will then say, I don't believe you because that logical statement is not consistent with the other ones. That judgment's not consistent with the other ones. And then you'll say, I'm a mountain climber. I don't know anything about anything. except for what they are. But I know mountains. Okay, you have an expertise in mountains. I'll ask you a few more questions based on a set of questions to ask a mountaineer, so I may not be one. And then I will listen to you and your judgment on mountain climbing, but I won't listen to it on anything else. And I'll believe you when you talk about mountain climbing, but not anything else. Whereas a person who offers judgments on many topics, uh, and they're pretty consistent, who says, I think the car was, it could have been red or purple. I don't know. But it was moving fast. That person, you would say, you're going to believe him that the car was moving fast, maybe even faster than the speed limit, even if he doesn't know the color or remember the color, because that particular element of his knowledge you can get from someone else, or maybe less important at that point. So this is how a person who may not be equal to another in expressing what is exactly will be preferred over a person who's expressing an opinion when they don't often do so. So I'll leave it there for now.